Hello, and welcome to the first in your guest lecture series for Anthropology 418 Quantitative Field Methods. Today you're hearing from myself, Dr. Demps, and I'll be talking about my experiences doing ethnographic fieldwork in South India, and this beautiful picture is just one of the many scenes that I was fortunate enough to take part of while living there and trying to understand, in particular, how people pass on knowledge about honey collecting. But first of all, let's remember what is ethnography. An ethnography aims to describe the nature of those who are studied through writing. And this can be a variety of forms. It can include books and articles, certainly, but also recipes, songs, poetry, any type of written word that strives to understand the population about which you are writing. And so ethnographic researchers who do fieldwork try to gather empirical data on human societies and then write about it and understand the society more themselves and also transmit that knowledge to others. So here's just a few examples of very well-known ethnographies that have previously been published. Most notably, you've probably heard of Margaret Mead and her ethnography Coming of Age in Samoa. It was published in 1928, and it was a very radical publication at the time because she was trying to understand if the trials and tribulations of female adolescents are a cross-cultural phenomenon, if young women experience the same growing pains cross-culturally. And the answer is no. In fact, that she found that women come of age very differently in Samoa than in the United States, and it quite shocked people at the time that it was published. In 1964, Claude Lévi-Strauss published The Raw and the Cooked about the transformation of knowledge into meaning. Guests of the Sheik is a great ethnography. Elizabeth Fernea became an anthropologist because she went along with her husband while he was doing his dissertation fieldwork in an Iraqi village, and she ended up studying the female inhabitants of that village, and it's a really interesting story, published in 1965. And finally, some of you are reading Gang Leader for a Day, published in 2008, and all of these show you that there's a wide variety in the topics that can be studied, the methods that you can use, and the characteristics that you write about. You could talk about the composition of the village, the social characteristics, how people make a living, subsistence, language, marriage customs, material and spiritual culture. There's so much available to write about. And you can see how these researchers use a variety of methods like participant observation, interviews, and questionnaires. So what is fieldwork? If we're doing ethnographic fieldwork, we discussed ethnography. Fieldwork is the on-site collection of observations, often in an uncontrolled environment. Oftentimes we think of the field as someplace exotic, but really what we mean is an environment over which we don't have any control, meaning not the lab. We go out and actually live experiences with people, ask them about those experiences, and then express them through writing. So here's just some examples of previous anthropologists doing fieldwork. On the upper left, you see E. Evans Pritchard doing research with the Zonde in Sudan on magic, witchcraft, and religion. In the center, we have Bronislaw Malinowski with the Trobriand Islanders. He was studying trade rings, but if you're reading his diary, you know that he was interested in all aspects of Trobriand Island life. In the upper right, you see myself. This is when I was in Bolivia, and I was at a communal fishing event. In the bottom left, you see here's Margaret Mead and her then current husband, doing what anthropologists spend a lot of time doing, actually, and that is typing up her field notes. It's not all exotic sitting around playing musical instruments with the islanders. It's going and writing down your notes and writing down your ideas and trying to keep track of everything through writing. So there's a lot of writing involved in ethnographic fieldwork. Bottom center, we see Napoleon Chagnon with a member of the Yanomamo. And bottom right, this is Charlie. He was my undergraduate field assistant. He was with me for 2 months in India, and you can see him here with one of the children of the village. Okay, so before we get to the field, what do we need to do? We've covered this to some extent, but just to remind you, first we pick a question, then we figure out how we're going to answer the question, and to do so, we're going to need to pick a location, choose our methods, figure out who we're going to sample, figure out any logistics, where are we going to live, how are we going to get there, what types of permits do we need, and finally, how are we going to analyze our data, evaluate our ideas, and eventually communicate them to other individuals. So how does culture change over time? That was my question. Obviously it does, but what affects the directions that it changes in, and what affects which ideas stick around and which don't? So to answer this question, I have to come up with some conceptual and operational definitions. These are very important because if I don't define my variables, I can't gather any information about them. So here's two different definitions of culture, kind of more of a conceptual definition at the top, the attitudes and behavior characteristic of a particular social group. But that means we would only be measuring one thing per social group, and we're interested in how culture evolves and changes over time, which is dependent on individual behavior. So I ended up working with this operational definition, which is the second bullet point, that culture is knowledge, values, and other factors that influence behavior, which are transmitted from one individual to another. This gives me some more specific things to measure. I can measure knowledge about, in this case, honey collecting. I can measure values towards the forest, and I can measure factors like I can ask people, who did you learn this from? So let's go back to our question, because we're always moving back to our question when we're doing any type of research. So my idea is that we have some psychological heuristics, which are quick and dirty rules of thumb, that help us to sift through the massive amounts of information available in the world. What behavior are we going to copy when we observe so many different behaviors throughout even just one day? So what types of behaviors will we take on? How are we going to decide how to cut our hair or tie our shoes? Or how do we learn to ride a bike? So these heuristics can help us choose individuals or circumstances to model ourselves after. So, and these will affect the transmission patterns. What we learn can be affected by how we learn. If you only learn everything from your mother or your father, that will affect the types of information that you have. You probably never would have learned a text message. So what we learn also affects the body of knowledge in a population, because what we learn affects our behavior, and that affects what other people can copy. Don't worry so much if you don't understand this whole line of reasoning. Take another one of my classes if you'd like to learn more about this topic. But just basically, here's it put out in simple diagram. We have these social learning biases, which help us target important cultural information. I would like to know how these are used across the life cycle, so at different ages, and what are the consequences of these different learning biases? What is the consequences for the cultural evolution as a whole? So that's my question. Let's talk about location, because it's all about location. I could have gone anywhere in the world where there are people, but I chose to go to a field site. Sorry about that, my phone rang. Okay, where were we? Right, South India. I chose to go here to a town called Gonikapal. It's about 6 hours southwest of Bangalore in the Western Ghat Mountains. And you can see here on the right, the town of Gonikapal is in this forested region, and the dark green bands kind of surrounding the region are the remaining dry deciduous forests where there's a lot of honeybees and a lot of honey collection occurs. Why did I choose these sites in particular? Well, honey collection is a subset of knowledge that's very distinct and unique, and so it's quite easy to study and quite easy to figure out what people are learning, how they're learning it, and who they're learning it from. So that body of knowledge lends itself to answering this question very well. Why the town of Gonikapal in particular? Well, logistically is quite convenient to me because there was a lot of French researchers working in and around the area, and they gave me contacts to important people like Forest Department representatives who were very important for giving me my research permits to work in the area. So there's a lot more that goes on in choosing a field site than just interest. It also has to be feasible, and that's pretty much why I ended up with this region in particular. So I was working with 5 villages in this area. There were 476 people total in these villages, and they're all from a tribe called the Jenu Karuba. Jenu means honey, Karuba means kind of like local tribe, and they were known as a honey collecting tribe, so great people to ask about honey collecting. They're a scheduled tribe, which is a specific governmental designation, which means that they're designated as an indigenous population or a first dweller in this area. And they've been living in this for longer than recorded history. They live in extended family units within these villages, so usually about 3 generations per household, and families tend to cluster households around a a main patio, so you can get some grandparents with several of their adult children and their families kind of living in the same family compound. I picked these villages over other villages in the area because, kind of tragically, there's been a history of forced migration out of the forested areas as the government has decided that they need to protect the forests from encroachments. So a lot of the Janukuruba who traditionally live in the forest now live along the highways. But these are rather well-represented villages in that they've gotten rights to maintain their houses and small-scale cultivation within the forest, and that these rights are now enshrined in the Indian Constitution. So they have a continuing connection to the forest, which is really important for learning about local knowledge like honey collecting. Their income comes mostly from wage labor on coffee estates outside the forest. They'll send jeeps in to pick up people to come and labor for the day. They also do some cultivation, and most lucratively, when honey is in season, they can make as much as they would wage laboring for 1 week by just collecting 1 to 2 kilograms of forest honey. So when forest products are available in the forest, they can make a lot of money collecting and selling those. I also selected this site in particular because it was a very good size. There was 5 villages with a large population, so I could look at a lot of variation within knowledge. And their location was fairly easily accessible, and also they were still in the forest, so they could still continue doing these activities. They had decent facilities. I ended up having a house of my own to live in. And they liked me. And goodwill is really important. If you've read their Yanomamo, they weren't cutting my canoe and sending it downriver in these villages. They were fairly easy people to work with. Okay, so the specific methods that I used, I'll go through each of these slide by slide, but this is kind of in the order that I did the research activities. So I started off with the census. I went around to all of the different households. Here's younger me doing a census interview, asking about household composition, who lived there, their sex, their age, their education, and any honey collecting experience, so I could build a census from which I could sample honey collectors, non-honey collectors, and men and women both. I also took this time to get to know people, let them get to know me, explain a little bit about what my research was going to be doing, and do some brief interviews as well, talking to people about honey collecting and who goes out and why and what they do. So after I finished censusing all of the households and making maps of all of the villages where all the households were, I started doing some participant observation, meaning that I would go out honey collecting with the guys when it was the honey season, and they would take me and show me where their secret spots were, and they would show me how to open up a tree. In this case, this was a particular bee species that lived in a tree, how to make smoke, and how to extract the comb safely while up in a tree. Other times I would just hang out with the boys in the forest, see how they were learning the skills. So the middle picture is a bunch of boys playing a tree climbing game after school. It's a game called Marikoti. Mara means tree and Koti means monkey. So it's basically like hot lava monster up in the trees. And you can see the hot lava monster kid on the right-hand side there. I also spent a lot of time doing unstructured interviewing, basically sitting around listening to conversations. So the picture on the right is the shopkeeper. It's just one shop for 5 villages, and it's kind of where people congregate. And someone had brought in honeycomb, and they were talking about it to stay. And here's the shopkeeper's son also listening in on the conversation, so participating in that cultural transmission process just by being present, listening to these conversations. So here's just some more pictures of honey collectors and what I was recording them doing. So the gentleman on the left is actually transferring a beehive from out of a termite mound into a beekeeping box. There was some training going on in this area about keeping bees in boxes like we do, and he's literally just scooping them out of the beehive with his bare hands and depositing them in the box. And he had special knowledge about which one was the queen, and he found it and showed me that she smelled differently, and he was telling me about the structure of the beehive and all sorts of interesting information. The gentleman on the right was talking to me about moving safely through the forest, and he's showing me his bow there and the clay pellet you can see in his left hand that he uses to scare away animals. And this is just the type of bow that they use in this area. I'm not quite sure why they don't use bows and arrows. I didn't get around to asking that because I was so interested in honey every time I was talking to people. But it's a rather unique system, and I can tell you about it more if you want to talk to me about it later. The guy on the right is showing me how to make a smoky torch. It's really important to make it correctly because you want large, continuous, copious amounts of smoke. So you have to make sure that it burns continuously and makes a lot of smoke production while you're climbing up the trees and accessing the beehives. And also I spent some time just hanging out with the kids, figuring out how their lives were structured, what the learning opportunities were, what the expectations for girls versus boys were, who was moving around the forest, and trying to get a picture of how kids age into the society while collecting knowledge on how to collect honey. And one of the things I got to do was go to the school a few times, so if you can, on that upper right-hand picture, see if you can find the anthropologist. There she is. So I spent about 9 months total doing participant observation in concert while I was doing the census and some other things to really get a feel for what different people of different ages knew about honey collecting, so I could create a questionnaire. So if I want to be able to test who knows what knowledge at different ages, I have to know as much as the most experienced honey collector. So that's why I had to spend so much time hanging around with these guys, learning what they know. And in my papers, I refer to the questionnaire as a multidimensional interview because it's really a variety of different interview techniques, mostly structured questions at a range of variables, nominal, ordinal, ratio, and interval. But also I would do things like show them pictures and ask them, what's in this picture, or tell me about this picture, or which one of these 2 hives in this picture has more honey, etc. And then I would also ask them questions. We did free listing, we did memory questions about learning through childhood, so we did demographic information on household wealth and prestige, experience honey collecting and what their last experience was, and the group dynamics, knowledge about honey collecting obviously, and also practical knowledge, which I'll show you on the next slide. So a lot of different types of questions and modes of information gathering, and it gave me a very good picture of what was going on in this population. So here's me writing down the answers in my notebook. Okay, so here, to complement the verbal answers, to get a real understanding of how people know how to collect honey, is to ask them to do the skills that are required for honey collecting. So in the upper left you can see a bunch of individuals making smoky torches. We gathered a bunch of these same types of leaves. We had everyone make a torch out of it. We photographed the torch. We measured how smoky it was, length, girth, that kind of thing, to see how people progress through ages making these torches. We also had a tree climbing competition, so I call these the Jinu Karuba Olympics, to see how you have to collect honey high up in trees, and you can see how high up you have to go sometimes here. So we had a speed test who could get up to this high branch right at the top of the picture and down again, and this guy did it in under 60 seconds, so really impressive tree climber. It's smooth bark, there's no branches there, he's just up and down. And you can see the guys here at the bottom waiting for their turn. They also did honey identification and taste tests, as well as a few other methods. So, the sample. How did I know who to interview? Well, one thing that was very lucky for me was that I asked the multidimensional interview questions to almost all of the honey collector men and almost all of the boys. So almost everyone who has, as an adult, had experienced honey collecting, and anyone as a child who could do honey collecting. As I said, it's a male activity. I had my sample. So this is great. We almost have a whole picture of the population. So I was not actually doing a sample since I got to talk to pretty much everybody. But however, I also wanted to talk to women and girls, so I did draw a random sample from my census of women and girls that I wanted to ask these questions to get an idea of how much the sexes vary in terms of honey collecting knowledge. So you can see here up at the top, this is Manjula. She was one of the girls I interviewed, and she's holding a bowl full of honeycomb that her brother-in-law, who was the guy climbing the tree in the previous picture, brought into the household. And here are some of the boys that I talked to. Also, you can see on the bottom right, this one on the left-hand side has the bow slung across his back. So here's Charlie, my research assistant, in the main picture, interviewing this small boy through his translator with the interview questions. And then, of course, we only could get who we could get to come and do the Jenakaruba Olympics. We couldn't force people to climb trees. So we ended up with 71 people total doing the tree climbing competition. One big issue in this research project was we wanted to know how knowledge changes with age. So we had to know people's ages. First of all, we wanted to interview kids 6 and older. Under the age of 6, they really didn't know enough about honey collecting to be able to answer any of our even very easiest questions. So you know a kid is 6, as I told you, when he or she can reach over the top of the head and touch the ear, and here's Chinana on the right, just 6 years old, can barely do it, and 2-year age ranges 8, 10, and 12, going to the left. As you can see, the arms get longer. After that, we had to do a combination of asking age, asking for genealogies, correlating ages between siblings, and with major events that had occurred historically as well. Most of the ages we're confident that are pretty accurate, and honestly, since we were concerned mostly about comparing ages between one another, it wasn't important to get exact, down to the very month ages, but relative ages were more than sufficient. So, just to show you what doing fieldwork was like, here's Charlie in front of our house. He's hanging out with a cow who was our neighbor. I had to sweep my yard every day when these leaves fell down on it to keep it clean. Here's my glamorous bedroom / kitchen. So I would make breakfast and lunch here every day, and then we would share our dinner with the neighboring family. It was actually quite comfortable. I was really happy to be working here because there weren't any mosquitoes. You don't see a mosquito net there. And there weren't any leeches, which I'm irrationally afraid of. So I'm glad that those weren't around, as they are in so many other field sites in the tropics. Let's talk about some problems, because if you do field work, you will encounter problems. Every time I look at this picture, the song pops into my head is, one of these things is not like the other, one of these things just doesn't belong. And so I was planting rice this day with these guys on their farm. You can see I get to pull my pants up for a change up to the knee, yay, because we were out in the mud field. But you can see I'm the only female present. And that was one of the difficulties with field work is I couldn't go anywhere in the forest alone. I had Jenny, my research assistant here in the orange polo shirt next to me. We went everywhere together because it wasn't culturally appropriate for me to wander around in the forest alone. Also, I went honey collecting a lot, but I'm sure the guys went out without me sometimes because I was a woman, and it could make things just a little different to have this great white anthropologist hang around out there with you, especially as a woman. So, life is not perfect. You just have to work with what you got and try to get the best data possible. It also rained a lot, so you can see I'm wearing my raincoat there. But overall, I had a great experience doing fieldwork, and I really enjoyed it. Some problems that other people have encountered, and I recommend reading this book. I've been gone far too long. It's a really funny book full of stories about when field trip fiascos, basically in expedition disasters, as the subtitle is named. You can have problems getting permits. I had to wait 10 months to get my research visa to go to India, and even then I had to get further permits to work in the forest where I was working. So it can be very tricky getting permits, waiting for permits to come, and then using permits. Sometimes people even still challenge your use of those permits when you need to do your research. So that's probably the most important logistical hurdle to get over, because without your permits you can't access the field site. Loneliness is a big one, especially since anthropologists tend to work alone. So being alone in a foreign culture can be really psychologically difficult, which is why we talked about keeping the journal if you do find yourself alone. Otherwise, when possible, structure it so you have a research assistant. I had two. I had Charlie and Jenny with me. There was a lot of French ecologists working in the area I could go and have dinner with from time to time, which was really nice. I could use a fork and speak rapidly in English, and it was very relaxing. So just be aware that that will be a problem. You think it won't, but it will. So take some measures to prevent that. Food and illness can be a problem. If you're in another country or culture where the food is very different from what you're eating, it's surprisingly more difficult than you think it is. I learned how to cook while I was doing this field work because I was tired of eating spicy food for breakfast. So I would make pancakes on Sundays sometimes, and my assistant Jenu, the Indian research assistant, would eat ketchup on his pancakes because they don't eat sweet breakfast. They eat savory and spicy breakfast. So, we both had trouble adapting to each other's food systems. You probably will get sick if you're in a foreign country, so just usually try to include some time for that in the schedule. Some anthropologists working in remote locations have had to deal with poachers. I know some that have had to carry guns to protect themselves, or if they're working with primates to scare off poachers from the populations that they're trying to study. Fire. So Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder, one of the authors here, she's the one who had her data burned down in her hut. I think it was in Kenya or Tanzania. The propane tank exploded while she was away, and the house burned down along with all of her data. And the government came looking for her and her husband because they thought that they had bombed their village, basically. So, back up your data, keep multiple copies, be aware that disasters like floods and fires, they'll happen. Wild animals can be an issue. So I couldn't leave my house after dusk because there were wild elephants in the forest where I was living, and they like to travel at dusk. And they could very easily kill me. In fact, there was a couple of people who in the villages I was working in who had died recently from encounters with elephants. And finally, acceptance. Acceptance by the communities. It can be very difficult, so you really need to work with a community. You might try for a long time to get acceptance into that community. It can be difficult when the community is resisting your efforts to be accepted. Again, just something to consider ahead of time. So all of these are very relevant problems that most anthropologists have faced while doing fieldwork. So finally, I just thought I would conclude by telling you about what I found out in my study. This is just one tidbit of knowledge. There's lots more there. If you want to hear about it, I'm happy to talk about it. One of the research questions I was asking was about how people use honey to make medicine. There's two different types of medicine. There's household medicine, like home remedies, and there is specialized medicine practiced only by gurus, the medicine men of the different villages. So I was asking people, have you ever been given medicine made with honey? And the home remedy people, getting ahead of myself, let me back up. The graph on the right is talking about just the home remedy. So about 70% of people have been given a medicine made with honey. A little over 60% could recite back to me the recipe that they were given. Out of that slightly over 60%, I asked, have you ever made the medicine? So did you learn it? Did you retain the information? And have you possibly transmitted it to someone else? And just over 50% of people said that they had actually made the medicine for somebody else. So this is great. This means that because this knowledge is being transmitted with a high frequency, it's a very stable body of knowledge in the population. So then I went around and asked everybody, have you had medicine from a guru? Do you know how to make it? Who's a guru in your village? And the sad truth is that there are no longer any gurus in any of the villages. I actually went around to 28 trying to find one, any of the villages in the region, because they have access to free Western medicine at hospitals that are about 5 to 10 kilometers away from all of the villages now, which is very good. It's free for them, and they get good medical care for free there. But also that this local knowledge about using honey for making medicine has been entirely lost in the population. So that's what I learned while doing my field research. I've got a lot of other great information, and please, if you want to take a couple minutes to jot down questions after listening to this presentation, I'd be happy to discuss them with you another time. I hope you're enjoying your day off, and you're looking forward to the other presenters that I've got lined up for you. Thanks for listening.